You think you understand defeat, but you don't. Defeat doesn't happen on the battlefield. It happens in the mind of a general who just realized everything he believed was wrong. August 1944, East Prussia. A room full of Germany's finest military strategists made a calculation, a simple mathematical certainty that would win them the war. They were laughing. Within 72 hours, that laughter would turn to silence. Within a month, to surrender. What happened in between wasn't a battle. It was a lesson in human psychology so devastating that it shattered an empire's confidence in its own superiority. Everything you've been told about World War II is a story of tanks and courage, of strategic brilliance and battlefield heroics. But that's not how wars are won. Wars are won in the space between confidence and reality. In the moment when a man who believes he's superior realizes he's been outthought by someone he considered inferior. The German generals of 1944 were the finest military minds of their generation. They had studied Clausewitz. They had pioneered Blitzkrieg. They understood war at a level that made them legends. And they were about to be defeated by something they never even considered a weapon. Trucks. Not strategy, not tactics, not battlefield genius. Trucks driven by men they believed were racially incapable of complex thought. The story you're about to hear isn't about military victory. It's about the moment when certainty meets contradiction, when expertise meets innovation, when a rigid mind shatters against flexible reality. Here's the truth they never teach you in history class. The German military lost World War II the moment they calculated what was impossible, and the Americans did it anyway. This isn't about resources. It's not even about industrial capacity. It's about the fundamental difference between two ways of thinking, two approaches to reality itself. The Germans believed in perfection, in efficiency, in doing things the correct way according to doctrine, following rules that had been refined over centuries of military science. The Americans believed in something else entirely: volume, redundancy, the willingness to waste, to break, to destroy their own equipment in pursuit of a single objective. One side optimized, the other side overwhelmed. One side calculated the proper solution. The other side threw 10 solutions at the problem and kept the 3 that worked. And when these two philosophies met on the highways of France in August 1944, something happened that German military science had declared mathematically impossible.
The Americans moved faster by being wasteful. They succeeded by violating every principle of efficiency. They won by doing everything wrong, so overwhelmingly that it became right. What you're about to witness isn't a military operation. It's a masterclass in how certainty becomes the weapon that destroys you. To understand what happened, you need to understand how expertise becomes a prison. The German General Staff in 1944 represented the pinnacle of military education. These were men who had spent decades studying warfare. They knew logistics down to the last calculation. They could predict fuel consumption, mechanical failure rates, supply requirements with precision that approached perfection. And that knowledge was killing them. Because expertise creates patterns in the mind. Neural pathways that become so deeply ingrained, they're no longer questioned. When you've solved a problem the same way 1,000 times, your brain stops considering alternative solutions. It doesn't even see them. This is the curse of mastery. The more you know, the less you can imagine. The German generals looked at American supply lines stretching 400 miles from the Normandy beaches to Patton's advancing army, and they saw a mathematical certainty. No army could sustain such speed. Physics wouldn't allow it. History had never witnessed it. They calculated that an armored division consumed 150,000 gallons of fuel daily. They knew the Americans were operating over damaged roads, through territory the Germans had systematically destroyed during their retreat. They understood that mechanical failures would compound, that vehicles required maintenance, that drivers needed rest. Every calculation led to the same inevitable conclusion. Patton's advance would halt within 48 hours, maybe less. What they didn't calculate was the possibility that someone might simply ignore those limitations. Not solve them, ignore them. This is where human behavior becomes fascinating. When an expert tells you something is impossible, he's not lying. Within his framework of understanding, it genuinely is impossible. His calculations are correct, his logic is sound. But frameworks can be wrong. The Americans approached logistics from a completely different mental model. They didn't ask, what's the most efficient solution? They asked, how do we keep moving no matter what? When a truck broke down, German doctrine said repair it. American doctrine said push it into a ditch and use the next one. When fuel ran low, Germans calculated optimal consumption rates. Americans built pipelines under the ocean and trucks that burned fuel just to deliver more fuel. When drivers reached exhaustion, Germans implemented rest schedules. Americans gave them stimulants and kept them driving for 72 hours straight. This wasn't stupidity. It was a completely different definition of success. Germans defined success as efficiency, no wasted resources, proper procedures followed, everything done correctly. Americans defined success as the objective achieved. Everything else was negotiable. And here's the profound truth about human conflict. When two systems collide, the one that's willing to break its own rules wins, because rules are limitations, and limitations only matter if you accept them. The German generals were trapped in a mental prison of their own expertise. They had decades of knowledge telling them exactly how logistics worked. They could calculate tonnage and distance and consumption rates with mathematical precision. But they couldn't imagine someone who simply didn't care about those calculations. This is the pattern that repeats throughout history. The expert who loses to the amateur. The master defeated by the beginner. Not because the amateur is better, but because the amateur doesn't know what's supposed to be impossible. The Americans in 1944 were about to commit logistics heresy. They were going to violate every principle of military supply doctrine, and they were going to win precisely because of those violations. August 19, 1944. Wehrmacht headquarters, East Prussia. General Alfred Jodl sits at a mahogany table covered in maps and intelligence reports. He's one of Hitler's most trusted military advisors, a man who has calculated the destruction of armies with the precision of an accountant. He pulls out his slide rule. Yes, a slide rule. This is before computers, before calculators. Every calculation done by hand. Patton's Third Army, 12 divisions, distance from supply depots, 400 miles. Daily consumption, 12,000 tons minimum. He does the math. He checks it twice. He shows it to his staff. The conclusion is undeniable. Patton will run out of fuel within days. The American advance will grind to a halt. The Germans will have time to regroup at the Seine River. Perhaps they can hold until winter. Jodl is smiling now, because the math doesn't lie. The Americans have overextended.
They've made the classic blitzkrieg mistake. They've prioritized speed over sustainability. And any military academy student knows what happens next. You exploit the pause. You counterattack the exhausted enemy. You turn their advantage into vulnerability. This is Warfare 101. The Americans are about to learn an expensive lesson. What Yodel doesn't know, can't know, is that 125 miles away, a completely different calculation is being made. Not by generals, by truck drivers. 5,958 trucks are lining up on a one-way highway. They're about to drive in a continuous convoy, headlights blazing, through day and night, violating every principle of military concealment. The plan is insane by German standards. Trucks every 30 seconds. No spacing, no blackout discipline, no rest stops except for fuel. German doctrine would call this suicidal. You don't reveal your supply lines to enemy observation. You don't bunch vehicles together where a single artillery strike could destroy dozens. You don't run drivers until they hallucinate from exhaustion. But the Americans aren't following German doctrine. They're not even following their own doctrine. They're improvising a solution that shouldn't work, and they're about to make it work through sheer audacious volume. Here's another example. September 1st, 1944. A German reconnaissance unit is positioned on high ground overlooking the main supply route. They're watching through binoculars, counting vehicles. The officer keeps counting. 100 vehicles, 200, 500. He stops counting at 1,000 because he realizes the count is meaningless. The vehicles never stop coming. An endless river of steel flowing east. He radios back to headquarters. Continuous vehicle column, headlights visible for 20 kilometers. Americans have abandoned all precaution. The German officers receiving this report don't believe it at first. No army operates like this. It's tactically insane. A few bombers could destroy the entire convoy. But the Luftwaffe is gone, and the Americans know it. This is the power of understanding what your enemy can and cannot do. The Germans were still operating under the assumption of mutual vulnerability. We can bomb you, you can bomb us, therefore we both hide. The Americans had achieved air superiority so complete they didn't need to hide. They could turn on their headlights and dare anyone to attack. This is warfare psychology at its most brutal.
When you make your enemy's weapons irrelevant, you don't just win the battle, you break their mental model of how war works. One more example. A German Panzer Division commander named Edgar Feuchtinger observes the Red Ball Express from concealed positions on August 30th. He's a veteran of the Eastern Front. He's seen logistics operations across 1,000 miles of Russian steppe. He understands supply chains at a level that most officers never achieve. And what he's watching makes no sense within his framework of understanding. The Americans are running trucks at speeds that will destroy the engines. They're overloading vehicles beyond their rated capacity. They're driving in conditions that should require maintenance stops every 100 miles. And somehow, it's working. His report to Army Group B headquarters is almost poetic in its confusion. The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. They don't hide, they don't conserve, they don't follow any rules we understand. It's not military science. It's mass production applied to warfare. That last sentence is the key. Mass production applied to warfare. In a factory, you don't try to make every unit perfect. You accept a failure rate and compensate with volume. If 30% of your products are defective, you make 40% more. The cost is worth it because speed matters more than perfection. The Americans had applied factory logic to military logistics, and the Germans, who still thought like craftsmen, couldn't comprehend it. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating, because the Red Ball Express wasn't just about trucks and fuel. It was about race.
75% of the drivers were African American, in a segregated army, serving a country that didn't allow them to vote in many states, driving supplies to generals who wouldn't eat at the same table with them. And the Germans, with their theories of racial superiority, were being defeated by the very people they claimed were inferior. Think about the cognitive dissonance this created. Nazi ideology was built on a foundation of racial hierarchy. The entire justification for the regime rested on the belief that Aryans were superior, that other races were subhuman, incapable of complex thought or technical achievement. And now German officers were watching African American soldiers perform logistics miracles that German technical expertise couldn't match. Some German prisoners of war were forced to work alongside African American sergeants,
Loading trucks, taking orders, watching these men calculate weight distributions faster than German engineers, watching them repair vehicles in minutes that would take German mechanics hours. Everything they'd been told about racial capability was being contradicted by direct observation. This is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. When core beliefs meet contradictory evidence, the mind has two choices: adapt or deny. Some German soldiers adapted. They began to question everything they'd been taught. If the regime was wrong about this, what else were they wrong about? Others denied. They created elaborate explanations. Maybe these weren't really African Americans. Maybe they were being supervised by white officers. Maybe it was propaganda. But the evidence kept mounting. The trucks kept rolling, and the cognitive dissonance kept growing. Here's the deeper insight. The Red Ball Express wasn't just militarily devastating, it was philosophically devastating. It proved that the entire German worldview was flawed, that their theories of racial superiority were not just morally wrong, but practically wrong, that they had built their entire society on a lie that was now collapsing under the weight of observable reality. And nothing destroys morale like realizing your fundamental beliefs are false. American soldiers could fight with conviction because their cause was just. Even the African American soldiers, despite facing discrimination at home, understood that defeating Nazi racism was worth fighting for. German soldiers were watching their ideological foundation crumble. Every truckload delivered by an African American driver was evidence that everything they'd been taught was wrong. This is the power of contradiction. It doesn't just defeat armies, it defeats minds. But there's another layer here, an even more disturbing one for the German command. The Red Ball Express revealed something about American culture that terrified them more than tanks or bombers. Americans were willing to destroy their own equipment to win. Think about what this means from a German perspective. You've been taught efficiency. You've been trained to maintain equipment properly. You follow procedures because procedures prevent waste. And now you're facing an enemy who throws away trucks like tissue paper, who burns more fuel moving fuel than your entire army receives, who accepts 30% mechanical failure rates and simply builds more trucks. This wasn't just different logistics.
This was a different relationship with material reality. Germans came from a culture of scarcity. Europe had been resource poor for centuries. You conserved, you maintained, you made things last. Americans came from a culture of abundance, the richest nation in human history. They could afford to be wasteful because they had waste to spare. And in war, abundance is a weapon. When your enemy knows you can lose 5,000 trucks and replace them in a week, what does that do to his will to fight?
when he's rationing his last ammunition and you're firing unlimited artillery barrages, what does that do to his sense of hope? The Red Ball Express wasn't just supplying Patton's army. It was broadcasting a message. We have so much, we can afford to waste it. How can you possibly win? This is warfare at its most sophisticated. Not destroying the enemy's army, but destroying his belief that victory is possible. German generals began to understand something terrifying. They weren't just losing a war, they were losing to a completely different kind of civilization. One that operated on principles they couldn't counter because those principles violated everything they understood about resource management. You can't defeat abundance with efficiency. You can only match abundance with abundance. And Germany didn't have abundance. They had expertise, they had discipline, they had centuries of military tradition, but they didn't have 5,000 trucks they could destroy and not care about. September 8, 1944. General Hasso von Montufeld, commanding German forces in the region, submits a report that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. American supply lines show signs of strain. Convoy intervals have increased from 5 to 15 minutes. Vehicle speeds have decreased. This is our opportunity. For 3 days, German commanders believed they were finally seeing the American system collapse. The Red Ball Express had overextended. Physics was finally asserting itself. The mathematical certainty they predicted was coming true. They prepared counterattacks. They repositioned forces. They drafted orders for the exploitation that would follow American paralysis. And then, within 72 hours, the Americans did something the Germans considered impossible. They reorganized the entire operation while it was running. Not by stopping, not by careful planning. They just changed it, on the fly, while trucks were still rolling.
They created intermediate transfer points that cut individual runs from 700 miles to 350. They implemented driver rotation systems that somehow materialized from nowhere. They established forward maintenance bases that appeared overnight. They doubled the number of assigned vehicles by reassigning them from other operations. By September 12th, delivery tonnage had increased above the previous levels. The crisis that should have paralyzed the Americans had made them stronger. This is when several German generals began to understand something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They were fighting an enemy that got better by failing. Think about this pattern. It's profound. German military culture punished failure. If an operation didn't work, you faced consequences. Officers were relieved. Plans were scrutinized. Procedures were reviewed. American military culture expected failure. They assumed things wouldn't work perfectly, so they built in redundancy. They gave junior officers authority to improvise. They rewarded solutions over procedures. When the Red Ball Express hit problems, nobody got fired. They just fixed it and kept moving. This is a completely different approach to learning. Germans learned by avoiding mistakes. Americans learned by making mistakes faster than the enemy could exploit them. One system optimizes for perfection. The other optimizes for adaptation. And in warfare, adaptation beats perfection, because war is chaos. The plan never survives contact with the enemy. The system that can improvise wins. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Germany's most competent defensive commanders, wrote a report in mid-September that reveals the moment of psychological collapse. If these reports are accurate, we face not a superior army, but a superior civilization. They make no effort to hide because they don't fear us. They waste resources because they have infinite resources. We cannot defeat this with military tactics. Read that last sentence again. We cannot defeat this with military tactics. This is a general admitting that military skill is irrelevant, that all his expertise, all his training, all his battlefield brilliance means nothing against an enemy that has a fundamentally different rules. This is the moment when confidence dies, when a lifetime of expertise becomes worthless, when you realize the game you mastered isn't the game being played. German officers began experiencing what we might call existential military despair.
Not fear of death, fear of irrelevance. They could calculate the perfect defensive position, but the Americans would just go around it because they had the fuel to detour. They could destroy American supply dumps, but new ones would appear within days. They could ambush convoys, but for every truck destroyed, 3 more would arrive. There was no solution within the framework of traditional warfare, because the Americans weren't playing traditional warfare. They were playing industrial warfare. And Germany's industry was being bombed to rubble, while American industry was producing more trucks per month than Germany had in its entire military. Some German generals began to psychologically disintegrate at this point, not from battlefield defeats, but from the realization that competence was meaningless. Imagine spending 30 years mastering a skill, rising to the highest levels of your profession, being recognized as one of the best in the world, and then discovering that someone using completely different methods is beating you effortlessly. Not beating you because they're better at your game, beating you because they're playing a different game, where your expertise doesn't matter. This is ego death at a civilizational level. The German military had defined itself by its expertise, by its tradition, by its superior training and tactical brilliance. And now truck drivers were defeating them. Not soldiers, drivers. Men who 3 months ago were civilians. Men who had no formal military training. Men who violated every principle of military logistics. And it worked. The German generals stopped laughing after the first week. By the 3rd week, they stopped making confident predictions. By September, they were writing reports that sound like philosophical lamentations. We prepared for everything, your tanks, your planes, your ships. We never prepared for your trucks. That quote from a captured German officer reveals everything. They prepared for military threats. They didn't prepare for industrial overwhelming force because they couldn't imagine it. Their experience, their education, their expertise made it invisible to them. Let me show you the mathematics of psychological warfare. The Red Ball Express operated for 82 days. During that time, it delivered 412,000 tons of supplies. That's over 5,000 tons every single day. Compare this to German logistics. The entire Wehrmacht in France was receiving 3,000 tons daily.
Total. For all units. The Americans were delivering more to Patton's single army than Germany was delivering to its entire Western Front. But numbers only tell half the story. Let's look at what those numbers meant on the ground. An American artillery unit could fire without restriction. German doctrine called this wasteful. American doctrine called it effective. During the siege of Metz in September, American artillery fired 100,000 rounds in 24 hours. The defending German artillery was rationed to 50 rounds per gun per day. Imagine being a German soldier in that situation. You can hear American guns firing continuously, hour after hour, day after day. Your own artillery fires a few times and goes silent. What does that do to your will to fight? You don't need to be a military genius to calculate the outcome. The side with unlimited ammunition wins. It's not even a battle. It's mathematical inevitability. Or consider fuel. Patton's tanks could maneuver freely. They could pursue defeated enemies. They could make flanking movements that required extra fuel consumption. German tanks were often immobile not because they were damaged, but because they had no fuel. Panzer divisions became stationary artillery. The most advanced armored vehicles in the world rendered useless by empty fuel tanks. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. You're in the best tank ever built. You're trained to the highest level. You know tactics that enemy crews haven't mastered. And you can't move. You're sitting in a steel coffin, waiting for American artillery to find your position. Your tactical superiority means nothing because you don't have the gasoline to employ it. This is what abundance warfare does. It makes skill irrelevant. But here's the truly devastating statistic. The Red Ball Express consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel daily just for its own operation. Not delivering fuel, using fuel. The Americans burned more fuel moving supplies than the German army in France received for all purposes. Think about the mentality this reveals. We'll burn 300,000 gallons of fuel to deliver 500,000 gallons of fuel. The inefficiency is acceptable because the mission succeeds. German doctrine would never allow this. The waste is too great. The inefficiency violates principles. But American doctrine didn't care about principles. It cared about Patton's tanks having fuel. And if you had to burn 3 gallons to deliver 5, that was still 2 gallons profit.
This is abundance mentality versus scarcity mentality. And in war, abundance wins. The Red Ball Express lost 5,000 trucks during its operation. Destroyed, abandoned, worn out beyond repair. 5,000 trucks. For Germany, that would be a catastrophic, war-ending loss. They didn't have 5,000 trucks to lose. For America, it was acceptable overhead. Ships were already arriving with replacements. The operation never slowed. This is the moment when German generals understood they were fighting an enemy that measured resources differently. Where Germans counted trucks, Americans counted factories. Where Germans worried about today's supplies, Americans knew tomorrow's production. You can't win that calculation. Not with tactics, not with strategy, not with brilliant generalship. When your enemy can lose 5,000 trucks and not care, you're not fighting a war, you're fighting an economic system. And you can't defeat an economy with an army. But behind these numbers were humans, and their stories reveal something the statistics hide. The drivers of the Red Ball Express operated under conditions that should have been impossible. 72-hour shifts, no sleep, Benzedrine pills to stay awake, hallucinating from exhaustion but still driving. 300 drivers died during the operation. Not from enemy action, from accidents, from falling asleep at the wheel, from trucks overturning on damaged roads. These men knew the risk. They drove anyway. Why? What drives a human being to operate beyond their limits, to volunteer for missions that might kill them, not from bullets, but from simple exhaustion? Some of it was duty. They were soldiers. They had orders. But for the African American drivers, 75% of the force, there was something more, something deeper. They were proving something, to themselves, to their country, to the enemy. Nazi ideology claimed they were inferior. American segregation treated them as second-class citizens. They couldn't vote in many states, couldn't eat in white restaurants, couldn't use white facilities, but they could drive. And by driving, they were winning the war. Every mile they traveled was a refutation of racism. Every ton delivered was proof that character and capability have nothing to do with skin color. They understood something profound. They were fighting two enemies: the Germans who wanted to enslave the world, and the prejudice that denied them equality at home. And they were defeating both.
one truckload at a time. Listen to this account from a driver named Corporal John Houston. He drove for 48 hours straight, fell asleep at the wheel 3 times. Other drivers revived him each time. He was delivering ammunition to an armored division that was about to run out. If he stopped, men would die. So he didn't stop. He delivered the ammunition. Then he collapsed and slept for 20 hours. When asked why he risked his life like that, his answer was simple. Those soldiers needed those shells. I wasn't about to let them down. No complex motivation, no heroic speech. Just a job that needed doing and a man who did it. This is the human reality behind the statistics. Real people, real exhaustion, real courage. Or consider Private Booker Washington. His truck caught fire from overheated brakes while carrying medical supplies. Protocol said abandon the vehicle. He didn't. He drove the burning truck 2 miles to a field hospital, jumped out as flames reached the cab. Those supplies saved lives, American and German, because wounded prisoners were treated too. When asked why he risked death to save medical supplies, his answer reveals something essential about human character. People were hurt. They needed help. That's all that mattered. Not nationality, not race, just humans needing help and another human willing to risk everything to provide it. This is what the German generals never understood. They thought in terms of racial hierarchies and national superiority. The Americans, despite their own racial problems, had stumbled onto a more powerful principle: mission over identity, objective over ego, getting it done over getting credit. The African American drivers knew they wouldn't get recognition. They knew when they went home they'd face the same discrimination. They knew they were fighting for a country that didn't fully accept them. They drove anyway, because the mission mattered more than personal recognition. This is strength the German system couldn't comprehend. Individual sacrifice for collective success. Personal anonymity in service of shared victory. The German military had esprit de corps, unit pride, national glory. But they didn't have this: the willingness to die without recognition, to succeed without credit, to win in obscurity. The Red Ball Express drivers were anonymous. No medals for logistics, no glory for truck driving, no monuments to the men who kept armies moving. They knew this going in. They did it anyway.
And that's the kind of character you can't defeat, because it's not motivated by reward, it's motivated by something deeper, purpose beyond self. By October 1944, the psychological impact on German forces was complete. Not just defeated, philosophically destroyed. Captured German officers were required to study Red Ball Express operations. Their conclusions are remarkable for their honesty and devastating for their implications. General Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Red Ball Express represents warfare we never imagined. Americans created a temporary civilization, thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, millions of tons of supplies that existed only to feed armies, then dissolved when no longer needed. We built permanent infrastructure over years. They created superior temporary systems in days." Read that carefully. Warfare we never imagined. This is an expert admitting his expertise was incomplete, that his education had missed an entire dimension of warfare. Or consider General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, the man who literally invented blitzkrieg tactics. His assessment is brutal in its self-awareness. We invented blitzkrieg, but never solved its fundamental limitation: logistics. Americans solved it through industrial excess we deemed impossible. The Red Ball Express was not a supply line, but a flowing river of material that drowned our forces. A flowing river of material that drowned our forces. That's poetry written by a defeated mind trying to comprehend its own defeat. But the most insightful analysis came from Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. When asked what surprised him most about American forces, his answer cut to the core. Not your tanks, not your planes, your trucks. The Red Ball Express showed us that you had militarized your entire society's production capacity. We were fighting your factories, not just your soldiers. Fighting your factories, not just your soldiers. This is the recognition that changes everything. War is no longer about battlefield tactics. It's about industrial capacity, economic depth, the ability to produce faster than the enemy can destroy. And in that contest, Germany never had a chance because America's industrial capacity was beyond anything Europe had ever seen. German factories were being bombed. American factories were expanding. German production was declining. American production was accelerating. The Red Ball Express was possible because America could afford to destroy 5,000 trucks.
Because American factories would build 10,000 more next month. This is the warfare of abundance. And once you understand you're facing it, hopelessness sits in. Because how do you fight abundance? You can't outproduce it. You can't outsupply it. You can't outlast it. All you can do is lose slower or faster. German officers began to experience what we might call existential military defeat. Not just losing battles, losing the framework within which winning was possible. Imagine being a chess grandmaster who just discovered his opponent isn't playing chess. He's playing a completely different game with different rules. And within his game, he's unbeatable. All your chess expertise is worthless, not because you're bad at chess, because chess isn't being played. This is what happened to the German General Staff. They had spent decades mastering traditional warfare, supply lines, logistics calculations, resource management, tactical maneuver, and the Americans simply ignored all of it. They created supply lines that shouldn't work. They achieved logistics rates that were mathematically impossible. They wasted resources on a scale that violated every principle. And it worked better than the German system. This doesn't just defeat you militarily. It defeats you intellectually. It invalidates your expertise. It makes your life's work seem naive. Some German generals never recovered from this. They couldn't integrate the contradiction. Their entire identity was built on military competence. When that competence proved insufficient, they had nothing left. Others adapted. They began studying American methods, not to copy them. Germany didn't have the resources to copy them, but to understand them, to see warfare from a completely different perspective. These officers would later contribute to NATO doctrine. They took the lessons of the Red Ball Express and integrated them into Cold War planning. The Americans had taught them something profound. In modern warfare, logistics isn't support. It's the main effort. Everything else is secondary. Win the logistics war and you win the actual war. No matter how brilliant your tactics, no matter how brave your soldiers, if the enemy can supply his forces and you can't supply yours, the outcome is predetermined. But there's another dimension to this story, one that's uncomfortable, one that reveals something about human nature that we'd rather not acknowledge. The Red Ball Express forced a racial reckoning within the American military itself.
Remember, 75% of the drivers were African American in a segregated army, doing work that was supposedly beneath white soldiers, but their work was winning the war. General Eisenhower visited Red Ball operations in September 1944. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded what happened. The general stood watching colored drivers, who'd been at it for 20 hours straight. He said, "These men are winning the war as surely as any infantry. We need to reconsider many things." We need to reconsider many things. That's Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, recognizing that the racial structure of the American military was not just morally wrong, it was militarily stupid. You had men proving their capability under the most demanding conditions imaginable, and you were denying them opportunities based solely on skin color. The cognitive dissonance was becoming impossible to ignore. White officers who commanded black truck companies had to confront their own prejudices. These drivers were performing at levels that exceeded white unit performance. They were more reliable, more dedicated, more willing to sacrifice. Everything racist ideology claimed was backwards. The supposedly inferior race was outperforming the supposedly superior one. Some officers adapted their beliefs. Others created elaborate explanations to preserve their prejudices. But the evidence kept mounting. And 3 years later, President Truman would desegregate the American military. The Red Ball Express didn't cause that decision alone, but it contributed. It provided undeniable evidence that racial segregation weakened American military capability. This is one of history's interesting ironies. The Red Ball Express was created within a segregated system, but its success helped destroy that system. The African American drivers understood this. They knew they were fighting for a country that discriminated against them. They knew they wouldn't receive equal recognition. They knew returning home meant returning to segregation. But they also knew they were proving something. Every successful delivery was evidence against racism. Every mission completed was proof of equal capability. They were patient. They understood that changing minds takes time, but they also knew that performance creates undeniable evidence. You can't maintain theories of racial inferiority when you perform better than everyone else.